as a final solution will not be a sustainable solution because we won't really need a sustainable peace. But we are fighting towards a two-state solution, classic example, as a stage. We are aware that on the Israeli side, that, as in Israeli politics, with politicians, it's a way of continuing the separation. I no longer believe personally in the sustainability of separating the two. But yes, 67.
Yeah, I just recently been to Jerusalem and West Bank. I was enjoying the week there. And one thing I did find is very little interaction between Palestinians and Israelis when I was in Jerusalem. The point I wanted to actually make was that the political scene seems to be drifting more and more to the right in Israel, and more, the right-wing parties. And I think it's something to do with perhaps the PR system that you have there. For example, Liebenberg or Lieberman, nutters like him, for example, are now in government. So I'm just curious that why, having had 40 years of conflict, and yet people seem to be now hardening their positions rather than softening them. Is that the same frustration that you're finding?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a terrible truth. Sorry, was that for me?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I was talking too loudly to my chair.
Yes, absolutely. The move to the right within Israel is very, very strong. And the propaganda machine convincing the main Israeli street is telling the Israeli street that there is no path for peace and that they want us in the sea, and that story is very strong and prevalent, and that security is everything, and that's why the wall's up, and that's why the army is still inside the West Bank, and certainly why, and because it is using the examples of the rockets coming from Gaza as the argument for see, we have no path for peace. And I want to add something to that. I can only demonstrate to you and to everybody here. No, actually, I'll go back one step. Despite that fact, and I think it is a fact, there is no denying that it's a very, very difficult fact to be working in our field. It means it's very, very, very demoralizing for us, certainly for the Palestinians. I mean, they see occupation. That's all they see. And that's a horrific reality for them. So I can't speak for them. If I have my Palestinian friend here, he or she would speak for that. And in terms of Israel, in our first year, as you saw in the video, we held a joint Memorial Day on the day when Israel holds a nationalistic memorial for all its soldiers who died in the conflict. Doesn't mention anything about Palestinians. We've taken a line to have a joint one which mentions the bloodshed on both sides. The first year when we started 8 years ago, we had 17 people come to the event. Last year we had 2,500. That 2,500 people did not come just to mark it. They come wanting to do something. So like you guys have gathered to do something and call to action. Similarly, those 2,500 Israelis, many Israelis, there were Palestinians there as well, but very few because they couldn't get permits to come in, had come because they were hungry to do something, how to do it, wanting to work together. And I remember my friend Mahmoud who managed to get the permit for one of the first times in his life, he turned around to me and said, "Ben, this long queue of people, do they all want peace?" I said, "I think so." So I think there is a peace movement. There is some organised action. It's not a majority by a long shot. But I do think an organisation called One Voice talking about 64% of Israelis still want a two-state solution. That's quite subtle. Want. What we're going to do about it is another issue. So there's a massive problem, it's true, and we can't stop because of that.
Richard, do you want to add to that?
Well, I spent most of my life talking about borders, and quite often in the Middle East. That's generally what I lecture on, international boundaries and borders. I wouldn't, I'd never pretend to know as much as to add to what you just said, but I have been on both sides of the separation war, both the Israeli side and the Palestinian side. And obviously the viewpoint of from international law is that the Israeli occupation is illegal of the West Bank, and that the 67 borders, in terms of international law, are the rightful borders of the State of Israel. Now, I just wanted to also broaden the conversation a little bit, though, and say that, you know, many walls are going up around the world, and that instead of looking for shared spaces, people are moving towards separate spaces. And in many ways, the security community and the security arguments are winning out. Walls are going up all the way along the US-Mexico boundaries. Walls are going up around migrants who want to make a better living coming from Africa up towards Europe. They're held in detaining camps on islands south of Italy. So walling, the threat that is painted, is being increasingly used at the political level.
My question is from your presentation. I think we need to look at the point of the UN. I'm not saying that the UN is a perfect organization, but really the UN has failed miserably right throughout the last 5-6 years, or even more, last 10 years. And I think as the West, or as principal people who operate the UN, we need to look at the UN and make it reformed fit for the 21st century. Because I come from Sri Lanka, and many of the things that we spoke about here are very much parallel to that country. And you see what's happening in the Maldives, you see what's happening in Kenya, and you see what's happening in Fiji, you see what's happening in Venezuela. So you need to have an effective mechanism to address these issues. Without that, and then I think the UN has basically failed, and that's a broader subject that I'm opening up to the entire audience around here, and also to the fact that from the organization which you represent, Combatants For Peace, you would actually see that the walls of dissent, of you being an enemy and you being a foe, is basically to the fact that extremists feed on extremists. So it is that what keeps that vicious cycle going, that it's one set of extremists who feed on the other set of extremists. It's the point of war. So how do we move the UN to be a much more effective organization towards maintaining those fundamental aspects within the world that we live?
Yeah, the United Nations has desperately failed in Syria. I mean, in other conflict zones, the United Nations has been quite vocal and quite quick in dispatching United Nations forces to keep the peace, but unfortunately they've been very quiet. So obviously, the Security Council is controlled by a select few nations, and Russia has a strong voice. And Russia, having taken the side of Assad, is obviously going to veto any action. But still, there should be a mechanism where one power can't veto protection for the nation. And I think there have been moves, for example, to have other nations to be part of the Security Council, largely to include India, etc. But it's been very slow progress. And I think
And again, we have the same situation with other organizations. For example, UNHCR. There have been many resolutions brought against countries, African countries, as well as countries like Sri Lanka. And you find this situation now that China is doing almost the same thing when it comes to Africa and some part of Southeast Asia in terms of effective action. We have the situation which is appalling in North Korea, which is this does not set a good environment for anybody who wants to be a dictator or a tyrant. The message now, it seems to be that you can get away with it, you can get away with it, because you don't see that accountability and democracy process happening anywhere in the world, really.
Yes, thank you.
In a way, it's part of the answer. I want to ask Amjad, and perhaps Richard would like to comment. Having seen the situation on the ground in Syria and encountered so much goodwill, is the continuing conflict there partly because the war is a proxy for the interests of the neighbouring big powers or other big powers? To what extent is it really a Syrian?
Yeah, mean, it started off as a Syrian war between the indigenous people wanting to have rights, you know, to get the needs that they have. So unfortunately, the controlling government has managed to subdue the people, and obviously it's now supported by Iran and it's supported by Russia. Russia is providing weaponry and keeping that power there, unfortunately. So there are vested interests. I mean, Turkey and Syria always had a difficult relationship. And there's always been, in terms of the Hatay province in Turkey, Syria's always said that belongs to them. And so there's lots of conflicts and powers that want to control the region. There's Saudi Arabia, who have, you know, disputes with Iran. And so they're bringing in support and weaponry with the aid of Qatar. So there are, you know, regional powers who are trying to control the situation and want to have their voice heard. So that's not allowing the conflict to be resolved, unfortunately. But yeah, there always is in these conflicts other powers that are trying to control the situation, just as happening in Ukraine at the moment.
Yeah, on a regional scale, I mean, Iran and Saudi Arabia are fighting out their rivalries on a number of locations, and it's having obvious effects, not just in Syria, which is in the worst condition at the moment, but Iraq and Lebanon are very much the same. And I suppose the Geneva process that started with a couple of years back, you know, obviously the US and Russia went ahead and had a 6-point plan. But it was really a shell of an agreement. The detail needs to be filled in. And both sides have committed to really a process without declaring what their bottom line will be. What are they prepared to accept as a settlement? So there are holes at many levels, aren't there, surrounding this conflict.
The people there are trying to resolve the issues. And when we were there in Syria, you know, there was Sunni and Shia people were trying to get together. The village was primarily Shia, for example, and the Sunnis controlled that area. It was controlled by the Free Syria Army, but they had protected that village. They said, look, we don't want to fight. We want peace in this area. We will protect the village as long as, you know, there's no sniper attacks, there's no trouble. So they were trying to resolve these conflicts so they could establish peace. But unfortunately, you know, there are external powers in play who want the conflict to continue.
Shafiq,
thank you, John. Thank you. It is mainly directed at Ben, if I may please. Let's start by saying that I find your personal account of the change that you went through quite moving, and I commend you for your courage and bravery and your humanity. It makes me feel rather proud of the fact that you were able to take those decisions. You said that you've got hundreds of members and thousands of supporters. I was just wondering, a thought going through my mind, whether those sorts of statistics can be enlarged to thousands of members and maybe hundreds of thousands of supporters, sympathizers, or maybe if not millions, hopefully, wishfully. Because I don't see that in terms of the international, if you like, scenarios, I don't see any context in which I see a resolution in the near future of the Palestinian-Israeli conflicts. But hearing your account of the way that Combatants For Peace has worked at you too, and if that kind of movement could grow larger and larger, if it was able to exert much greater political pressure from inside, do you foresee that kind of scenario happening in the foreseeable future or at any stage in due course? And any advice, by the way, you might have for me? I happen to be planning to go to Jerusalem in about a month's time as part of a course at St. George's College in Jerusalem called Sharing Perspectives, Christian-Muslim Relations in the Holy Land. Really looking forward to that. And some of my colleagues, as a Muslim, they were giving me some tips about, because we will be landing in Tel Aviv, myself and Imam Sultan Mahmoud. And they said, because you carry Muslim names on your British passports, of being Muslim, be prepared for and be exceptionally patient for any kind of things with reception at Tel Aviv before you let out. So any tips on that would be helpful. Don't say you're going to make any activists, because that's for sure. Thank you, first of all, and I'll talk to you, and we can exchange email addresses, and I can talk to you later about your trip. About expanding Combatants For Peace. As it happens in the last year, I've been going to Israel and Palestine quite a lot. I was there 6 months of this year. Part of my task was to do two things. One of them was to support the inner resilience of activists and the movement as a whole, to look inside to see how we can strengthen outside. And part of what came out of that was the need to restructure the organisation. The organisation has grown in terms of the demand of it, but also in terms of what its ambition is. And we come to a place in which we have prepared a reorganisation document, which we're trying to act upon, and our main barrier is, guess what? Money. So our intention is absolutely to expand and to grow and to have more affect, both within the region and also internationally. But to do that, we probably need to change something in our structure, because we're mostly run supported by volunteers who are tired. We're very, very, very tired, and also facing the reality that the gentleman there pointed out of the growing, on one side, stuckness on the Israeli side, and as a result, quite a lot of inertia on the Palestinian side. Inertia as a result of oppression, really. What else can we do? So, yes, our intention is to grow, and we need support to do that. And so, as I'm addressing this particular audience today, your support will be very, very useful. And I mean support through potential donations on our website, but also if you have any other ways of supporting us through giving me ideas of how to fundraise, how to grow our support base. I am setting up offensive Combatants For Peace here in England in due course. If anybody has desire to support that process, because also I volunteer, I don't pay myself to do this. And I have limited capacity, I have a family, I have to make a living, etc. So if anybody wants to join the effort to create a Combatants For Peace here in England, I have friends on, which will be a body which will be able to fundraise and have events like this, to create awareness-raising events, and please come to me at the end, that would be very useful. And I think you're right, expanding that voice within Israel and in Palestine, binational, non-violent work, is for me essential, and that is my life's work. That's what I'm going to try and do, to make sure that voice gets out more and more. Listen, I've travelled from South Devon today to get to you, so even coming to High Wycombe, it's no disrespect, it's quite a long way, was important to me, and thank you for inviting me, that's important. So every little helps, absolutely. So don't think, oh no, I can't do much. You can do something tonight.
The gentleman on the back, and then Ed, and I think we've called today.
Thank you very much to all of you for a fascinating evening. Perhaps a question for Richard first and foremost about political organisation. And if I could frame it, however imperfectly in Westminster our parties are broadly organised around secular political ideas, then with a ceremony of nationalists. When I went to Cairo in August 2011, I met some 6 presidential candidates and some other parties, and they seemed mostly organised around either personal fealty or religious allegiances. Is that typical, or do you think, first of all, do you think it's necessary to organise parties around secular political ideas rather than personal fealty or religious fealty? How does it actually work in practice in the Middle East, and what is the direction of travel?
There are so many cliches about the Middle East and how political systems work, and as usual, there's an element of truth in all of them. My enemy's enemy is my friend used to be the way in which various people lightly talked about the alliance building from government to government in the Middle East. But as our focus has gone more into intrastate affairs rather than interstate conflicts, it was certainly felt. I mean, no one is forgiving Hafez al-Assad or Saddam Hussein for the way in which they ruled their countries with an iron fist, appalling human rights records. Yet there were 1 or 2 statistical anomalies, sort of women's rights compared to, literacy rates, surprisingly high in some of those countries compared to one or two others. So there's a real dilemma there of education systems being amongst the more advanced and in a sort of regional way. So those states operated in a sort of secular way, I suppose. Whatever the state idea was. But I think to point to, I suppose in Turkey we have an Islamic government in many ways, but that operates in many ways in what most people perceive as a fairly inclusive, secular way. So I'm not really answering the question here because it was a good one and it was a big one. But I do feel that there is it's hard to say Turkey could be a model for other states in the region is going to cause some problems. But I do think there are, especially thinking back to the Ottoman Empire, but I do think there are some ways in which that system, and there's all sorts of bribery scandals at the moment, all sorts of problems. But I do think Turkey's managed reasonably well coming out of military governments only a few decades back, compared to some countries. I don't think I've answered what is a very good question. But I think, is that common with the Middle East, what you experience in Cairo? Yes. But perhaps.
I might say that religion is in play in a big way, but I would say that from my experience in Palestine particularly, I don't know about religion as much. It is in play, it is a card that's played. But I also think that it's probably a cliche of that being true. It's also challenged by progressives and liberals within all of the society, which do exist. You go to Ramallah and you don't think you're in an Islamic, well, it's not a state. You don't feel that. You feel you're in a Western city. Is that true? Have you been to Ramallah?
I've been to Ramallah.
It feels like a Western city, really. It doesn't feel like you're. And at the same time, when you stay in the West Bank and you wake up in the morning and it is predominantly Muslim in Turkana, you wake up to the calling at 3 o'clock in the morning, and you think, wow, if this was to happen in London or in Totnes where I live, people would go, oh, this is a bit unusual that this is the only sound we're hearing. I'm saying that when we hear the bells on Sunday ringing in the church, it's always in play everywhere, isn't it? It's in play here.
But progressive voices, as you're suggesting, do exist everywhere within the region.
More than we think. I think there's more progressive voices in all of these countries, in all of the Middle East, than we really, really hear about. I think that's what we really forget in Iran, in Iraq, everywhere. It's progressive voices.
All of us owe a debt of gratitude to Ed for organising this, so I think he gets the final question.
Involved, so I wouldn't take personal credit for my own thought. But the one small observation I would make from these stories is, and it's something that we all know from experience, is that when you first meet somebody who seems so different from you, whether that's somebody in early adulthood wearing a hood and standing around in the street corner, or whether it's someone who is a different colour, or somebody who has a different experience, just meeting them and talking with them, you actually realise you've got much more in common than you thought. And at a very human level, the meeting of people and spending time with them and giving space for each other seems to me to be where the most hope is. Not at the structural or political level. The structure happens really by the actions and the courage, the bravery, and the work that Amjad and Ben and others on the ground are doing. So I just have one last little question, because I did set this up as being something that I hope that everybody who came here was coming because of hope and might leave with hope as well. Not only hope, but also something that you can do. So we've heard a number of things that you can do, and I would, for a moment, having been a fundraiser in other circumstances as well, I would for a moment diminish the value of contributing to the kind of work that Amjad is supporting, that Ben and Combatants For Peace are doing. And I hope that many of us will support those tonight or in the weeks and months ahead. But I'd like to ask the panel, and I'd like to ask Steve as well, if that's okay, as you did as well, just the one thought or piece of advice that we here might do. A small act, it could be a very small act, it could be just inform yourself about experience. It could be something quite small, but something that we can do for ourselves and take responsibility for that might give us hope about what we can do in the situation.
I found an inspiring film the other year. It was made, the thing I alluded to, it was made 20 years after the coming down of the Berlin Wall, and it was noting the irony that 20 years later walls were going up. And there was a Canadian Broadcasting Corporation film called Up Against the Wall, and I don't know how generally accessible it is, but I've got a copy here, and I could, on my little desk, and I could make it available to wear. But I think that's an inspiring film. It's mainly activist-led, and it's looking at how you can overcome what states do when they put up barriers, and how people themselves manage to retain hope in those situations, including some of the ones we talked about today. So it was a terrific film. Very honeyed tones and sort of saccharine music as a background, but nonetheless, it was quite powerful. So that was helpful.
Well, on the theme of films, I think that the notion of personal transformation in adverse situations, and like the most adverse situations, has to convince us that it's possible. So to choose the opposite of what's obvious is inspiring and gives hope. So I recommend a film as well of about two fathers who lost their daughters, one Israeli and one Palestinian. It's called Within the Eye of the Storm, and it's made by the same woman who made that promotional film. And it's an extraordinary story, really, of these two men who met in what's called the Marine Families Forum in Israel, in Palestine. And I think that if they can continue to be peace activists and not so much forgive, but keep on working towards the opposite of what is revenge, then anybody can. Anybody can make peace if they can make peace. So I urge you to watch that film. And I would just put a little bit in your everyday life, because you might not see the film. You can get that film online if you just put Within the Eye of the Storm, it will come up, and you can buy it online, please do. It will help the filmmaker as well. I would suggest to you that if you have anybody or anything in your life that you see as your enemy, in any form, that be somebody or something, look it in the mirror, look it straight in the eye on some level, and see what mirror it's holding up to you about yourself, and what you're in conflict with within yourself. And then I guarantee there'll be something there.
I think on a personal level, what I like to do is if I see something happening, I want to do something. And that's what I'd advise other people. If you see something bad, feel it in your heart, try to act upon it, be passionate about it, and respond. Because otherwise, you may not do anything. A lot of people, they talk, they conceptualize, they say we could do this, we could do that, develop a strategy, but actually they don't deliver. So my advice is always look at the situation, talk to your neighbours, talk to your friends, get the true picture. Don't always believe what the media says. Find out for yourself through friends, through contacts, people of other faiths, of other nationalities, talk to them, and then act upon that. For example, the situation in Syria, I couldn't ignore it. It was just too bad. I felt bad with myself. I didn't do anything. I had to. So when you see something like that, act upon fine. That's all right.
I think it's for me to say thank you to Richard, to Ben, to Amjad for a most incredibly fascinating evening. One word has been used earlier, and it's the word that I was going to use, and the word is courage. And what strikes me is that in all this, we have seen this element of courage, of people who are willing to go against the grain, to protest, to be willing to stand up and be counted. And with that, for me, went an understanding of the role of prophets, whether they be the 8th century prophets, Hosea, Amos, Micah, whether they be Jesus or whether they be the Prophet Muhammad, upon all of whom be peace. All of them have given an indication of the need for us all to act in a prophetic way. So I'm grateful to our three speakers for what they have given us tonight. I'm grateful to you all for coming, but do me a favour. When you go, and in the next few days, talk about tonight. Because what has struck me has been the way in which there is hope. And all of us live with hope in mind. That's important, and that's for you and me to be doing, to indicating to others that there are people who are willing to protest, there are people who are willing to make peace, but there are people too who are willing to give hope and to live hope. So thank you to the three speakers, and thank you to you all.